As I was practicing the other day, I thought to myself, who wrote the first dominant seventh chord? Someone had to be the first. I spent hours looking through old books and scores until I think that I have finally found the answer. In 1605, Claudio Monteverdi published his fifth book of madrigals in Venice, and in the first madrigal, on measure 13 with one chord, he signified that he was headed in a radically new direction. We need a bit of context before understanding this chord, so allow me to introduce you to our two principal players in this drama. The first is Giovanni Maria Artusi. He was an Italian composer and theorist, and he was a canon at Santissimo Salvatore in Bologna. And second is Claudio Monteverdi. He was born in Milan and was a predominant composer of the late Renaissance period. He pioneered the genre of opera, and Orfeo, written in 1607, is the earliest opera that is still performed. Now, Artusi was a bit of an instigator, which he learned from his teacher, Gioseffo Zarlino. Zarlino was a preeminent music theorist of the 16th century, and is now remembered more for the words that he penned instead of his notes. Zarlino's important writings include treatises on counterpoint and systems of tuning. He developed and explained the theories that moved us away from the Pythagorean system and more towards mean tone and just intonation. Zarlino was ready to jump into a fight at any time to defend his ideas. For example, Galileo Galilei wrote Dialogue of Old and New Music in 1581, which criticized some of Zarlino's ideas. Zarlino responded in an article titled Musical Additions in 1588. 1 year later, Galileo responded again, and he wrote Discorso, and Zarlino responded again to that to defend his ideas further. Now, Artusi adored his teacher, and he got into Zarlino's habits of getting into polemical arguments anytime he felt it was necessary. One debate got so heated that the police were called after Artusi was accused of plagiarism. Now, as a theorist, Artusi also wrote a lot on a wide variety of topics. In his first major solo theoretical work, titled Second Part of the Art of Counterpoint Dealing with the Profit and Use of Dissonances, he had argued that composers were writing bad pieces and getting bad performances of those pieces because ensembles didn't know how to tune properly and they're constantly playing out of tune. More crucial to our story was his treatise in 1600 that was titled The Imperfections of Modern Music. This one is written in the form of a dialogue between two persons, Luca, a young student of music, and his wise teacher Vario. This book has two parts. The first deals with those tuning problems, and the second is a conversation between these two people where they're discussing the newest madrigals of an anonymous composer. This anonymous composer turns out to be Monteverdi, and Vario, the teacher, is really a substitute for Artusi's own ideas, and he trashes Monteverdi's madrigals. In particular, the one madrigal that he really takes issue with is called Cruda Amarilli, which is the first madrigal from the fifth book of Monteverdi's madrigals. The text of Cruda Amarilli comes from Giambattista Guarini's Il Pastor Fido, a story written in 1590 that tells the story of a curse that must be broken through matrimonial bonds. A shepherd named Myrtilus is here singing to the nymph Amaryllis. What was really important to Monteverdi was mapping his music to match the structure of the poem. Monteverdi broke the poem into three sections in his piece. First was measure 1 through 25, second was measure 26 through 43, and the last section was measure 44 to the end. These three sections make a fairly tight arch form. The first and the last sections are almost equal in length, 25 and 24 measures respectively, and the middle section is shorter and has a division at its middle in measure 34. The musical form crucially follows the form of the poem. The first section focuses on the two sides of Amaryllis, her love and her cruelty. The root word, amar, in her name, is also the root word for both love and bitterness. The second section also continues this juxtaposition of Amaryllis with talk of her purity and beauty, but also of her deafness, cruelty, and evasiveness after the dividing point in the middle. The final section is Myrtilus's inner conflict. If he speaks, he will offend, so he resigns to die in silence. This conscious mirroring of the musical structure to match the poem structure is this sort of rational thinking that was in the nascent stages before the Enlightenment era. This is representative of a shift in Monteverdi's musical output. This started around the third and fourth book of madrigals, but it really found its fullest fruition in this fifth book of madrigals. Now, before we dive into Artusi's specific musical objections, it's important that we understand the kind of musical theory context that they were both operating under in the 17th century. In the 17th century, composers used basically three hexachords. The first hexachord was the hard hexachord, and it started on the note G. The second hexachord was the soft hexachord, and that began on the note F. And then the third was the natural hexachord, which started on the note C. All of these can be thought of as a 6-note major scale with a central half step in the middle. If you wanted to modulate between hexachords that were a fourth or fifth apart, it was a fairly easy task because one of the pitches that was the half step of the next hexachord was just outside of the pitches of the old hexachord. A shift between the hard G hexachord and the soft F hexachords was much more difficult. These hexachords both used B and B flat, so you'd be introducing chromaticism with these half steps. You would have A, B flat, B natural, then C. At the beginning of the 17th century, there were only 2 key signatures that were used, the cantus durus without B flat and the cantus mollis with B flat. Each of these keys had many modes that were associated with it. Monteverdi only used these 2 key signatures throughout his entire musical output. By the end of the 17th century, all of the modern key signatures were, in theory, available, and key signatures with multiple accidentals were increasingly common. However, the modes under each key signature were reduced down to just 2. Major and minor. For us in the 21st century, our keys are tied up closely with their signatures, as our modern term key signature suggests. But in the 17th century, that wasn't necessarily the case. They weren't so tightly combined. Monteverdi's music was actually a crucial point in developing our modern key signatures. After hearing enough of this young upstart Monteverdi, Artusi wanted to do what he did best, which was start a written diatribe. Remember his previously mentioned treatise, On the Imperfections of Modern Music? Which was a dialogue between the student Luca and the teacher Verio. Here are just a few excerpts when Luca, the student, is recounting that he went to a concert the night before where some new madrigals were performed. The madrigals were sung and repeated without giving the name of the author. The texture was not unpleasing, but, as your lordship will see, insofar as it introduced new rules, new modes, and new turns of phrase, these were harsh and little pleasing to the ear, nor could they otherwise be for so long as they violate the good rules. In part founded upon experience, the mother of all things, in part observed in nature, and in part provided by demonstration. We must believe them deformations of the nature and propriety of true harmony, for removed from your object of music, which, as your lordship said yesterday, is delicatation. Signor Luca, you bring me new things which astonish me not a little. It pleases me, at my age, to see a new method of composing, though it would please me much more if I saw these same passages were founded upon some reason which could satisfy the intellect. But as castles in the air, chimeras founded upon sand, these novelties do not please me. They deserve blame, not praise. Let us, however, see some of the passages. Now I'm skipping some of the dialogue to fast forward to where Verio is commenting on them. Since I see that you are not mocking me, I will tell you what I think of them, but take note that I shall not be so ready to yield to their opinion. And for the first argument against them, I will tell you that the high is a part of the low, and arises from the low, and being a part of it, must continue to be related to it, as to its beginning, or as the cloud to the spring of which it is derived. That this is true, the experiment of the monochord will show you. How then will the first, second, fourth, fifth, and other measures stand if the highest part has no correspondence or harmonic proportion to the lower? They claim that they do observe harmonic relation. They say that all this is called grace and is accented singing. I do not remember having read in any author, and countless excellent ones have written of music, that there is such a thing as accented music. I should like to give you my opinion, but I suspect that it may displease you. Give it. I shall be glad to listen. It is my belief that there is nothing but smoke in the heads of such composers, and that they are so enamored of themselves to think it within their power to corrupt, spoil, and ruin the good old rules handed down in former times by so many theorists and most excellent musicians, the very men from whom these moderns have learned to string together a few notes with little grace. But do you know what usually happens to such works as these? What Horace says in the 10th ode of his 2nd book. "'Tis oftener the tall pine that is shaken by the wind, 'tis the lofty towers that fall with the heavier crash, and 'tis the tops of the mountains that the lightning strikes. In the end, they are built without foundation. They are quickly consumed by time and cast to the ground, and the builders remain deluded and mocked at." Wow, those are some harsh words for Monteverdi. When Artusi wrote this, he included, without the text, crucially without the text, he included some musical examples from the madrigals so that the student could look over the specific musical spots. So now let's look over ourselves some of those musical examples. Monteverdi structured Cruda Amarilli so that all the main sections, including the subsection at measure 34, end in G. This is what Artusi and Monteverdi both would have thought of as G mixolydian. The difference is that Monteverdi is thinking of this mode as a tonal one, and Artusi is not. To prove this point, Monteverdi cadences to scale degrees that are a fifth above G to D and a fifth below G to C. These are what we recognize as a subdominant and the dominant. This whole piece is a sort of struggle between G and C and which one is the real tonic. These two cadences to D and C were two examples that Artusi took a problem with. From Artusi's perspective, cadences to C have no place in G mixolydian. But Monteverdi is treating this mode not so much as mixolydian, but as Ionian. Between these two modes, there's a little bit of a tension between the pitch F natural and F sharp. Monteverdi plays with this tension by playing with the pitches F sharp and F natural, as these are both crucial half steps in juxtaposed hexachords. The pitch F sharp functions on a local level as the leading tone to cadence to G, or as a Picardy third for cadences to the dominant. This distinction between Monteverdi and Artusi's view of F sharp and F natural is crucial to understanding the tonal structure of the piece, which Monteverdi painstakingly took time to mirror the poetic structure of the poem. For example, let's look at measure 6. Do you remember how our teacher Vario said that he hadn't remembered in any passage ever reading about accent in music? Measure 6 is specifically what he was referring to when he wrote that. What he's taking exception to is that the canto and quinto voices have an F natural on a strong beat, serving as accented passing tones. The pitch F sharp was just in the texture 3 measures before in the alto voice. To show that this is no accident, Monteverdi does it again with even more tension in measure 12, with the quinto singing F sharp as the bass moves downwards on an F natural. This measure sets up the first dominant 7th cadence ever in measure 13. To analyze this first dominant 7th in its fullest context, we need to first turn to the text, because that's where Monteverdi would have turned to as well. The text at this crucial measure is ahi lasso, which is an interjection, a sigh. This sigh can be roughly translated as alas. This sigh delays the words instruct bitterly and is an emotional shift from the opening line. This small interjection highlights the lover's situation, both the cruelty of Amaryllis and his love for her. So to highlight that interjection and delay the next line of text, Monteverdi does a strong cadence to C. Then he restarts the text again in measure 14 in C, and in measures 17 through 18 he extends the music on ahi lasso. In measure 18 we get another G dominant 7th chord moving to C on the downbeat of 20, but this time Monteverdi avoids the full cadence with suspensions and contrary motion. So you can see in part how this mixolydian Ionian mode has the pitches F sharp and F that are pulling in different directions, and this is a perfect tonal allegory to Monteverdi's structuring of the poem. You have the cruelty, but then the love, both sides of it. So back to this first dominant 7th chord in measure 13. Above the G to C bass motion, the inner voices have a succession of harmonies: G, D minor 7, G major dominant 7th, and finally to C. This should solve any uncertainty about the true tonal center of the piece. As if all of this tension wasn't enough, Monteverdi has the top voice rest on the downbeat and then sing 2 dissonant tones before landing on the downbeat of 14 with a consonant tone. The high A is the highest pitch in the whole piece, and it comes back at every crucial cadential point. The leap to the F gives weight to the final resolution to the third of the C chord in measure 14. In Artusi's treatise, he had 7 excerpts that he found exception with, and 6 of them deal with this tension between G and C. As we've seen, Artusi repeatedly refers to this accented singing, which he sees as a way that is improper to resolve dissonances. Monteverdi, for his part, he objected to Artusi cherry-picking certain tiny excerpts and stripping the text away from them, because he was saying that Artusi missed the entire context of why he did what he did. Monteverdi responded to Artusi in his dedication to the 5th book of madrigals. I hereby present to your grace this group of madrigals I have created. Do not be surprised at my publishing these madrigals without first replying to the objection raised by Artusi to a few tiny portions of them. Since I am in the service of His Grace the Duke of Mantua, I do not have the necessary time at my disposal. Nevertheless, I have written the reply to show what I do is not done by accident. As soon as my reply is copied out, it will be published under the title The Second Practice over the Perfection of Modern Music. Some people may marvel at this, thinking that there is no other practice than the one taught by Zarlino, but they can be sure that, with regard to consonances and dissonances, there is yet another point of view which defends the modern compositional practice to the satisfaction of both the mind and the senses. I wanted to tell you this both to keep others from preempting my expression second practice. Believe me, the modern composer is building upon the foundations of truth. Live happily. So who do you think got the last laugh? Do you know of an example of a dominant 7th chord that is earlier than this one? If so, let me know in the comments. I love reading all of them and having a conversation with everyone. If you like this sort of content, please let me know and subscribe so that I can keep making it. Live happily.